studios in New York City. This is Charlie Rose.
Dick Cheney is here. He served 2 terms as Vice President, President George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009. He was a leading architect of the administration's war on terror in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks. He was also a strong supporter of enhanced interrogation, NSA wiretapping, and the Iraqi invasion. Proponents of the Iraq War have returned in recent weeks with criticism of the Obama administration's foreign policy. Dick Cheney has been a leading force in that effort. He and his daughter Liz recently wrote an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal questioning the president's leadership. The subtitle reads, "Rarely has a U.S. president been so wrong about so much at the expense of so many." I am pleased to have the former vice president at this table again. Welcome.
Good to be here, Charlie.
Let me start. Why did you write the op-ed?
My daughter and I did it together. Liz gets most of the credit. Okay. She let me put my name on it, but I wholeheartedly agreed, and I helped edit it.
You agree on most things?
We do. We spend a lot of time together. It's one of life's pleasures to have.
Now, was she with you when you went recently in March?
She was.
To the Middle East?
And that's partly what triggered our thinking. We went and covered, made a swing through the area, talked to a lot of my friends going back to the Desert Storm days 25 years ago. And we were deeply disturbed by what we encountered in terms of the total lack of confidence in this administration by our former friends and allies, a belief out there that the Obama administration supports the Muslim Brothers, for example, the fact that the relationship between Egypt and the United States, one of our most important friends in that part of the world, had gotten severely strained. It was a general view that we came away with, that we're in big trouble, that there is a very, very serious terrorist problem where the administration for a long time has claimed there isn't any. They got bin Laden problem solved. And the circumstances, obviously, most recently in Iraq have been deeply disturbing too. But you have the sense of a withdrawal from the region. That's exactly what Osama bin Laden said he was after when he hit us on 9/11, and we pulled out of Iraq without stay-behind forces. The president's now just announced we're going to pull out of Afghanistan in 2016 without stay-behind forces.
There will be some stay-behind forces in Afghanistan.
Well, I would hope so. Yeah. But when he said it the other day, he didn't mention that. And deep cuts in the military, a whole series of things that have come together. And we don't mean to be disrespectful of the president, but I have got, and as did my co-author, my daughter Liz, we feel very, very strongly that we're headed in the wrong direction. This administration is taking us exactly the opposite direction from which we ought to be headed.
Let's talk about Iraq, first of all,
okay.
Because that has brought to a fore this whole question and what to do there, because it is a very, very dangerous situation there, as you and everybody else, however you feel about the Obama administration. What do you think was right and what turned out to be wrong about the policies of the administration you served with George W. Bush?
Well, we can debate, spend a whole hour on the debate over that. As you said at the outset, I was a strong advocate of going into Iraq. I think that was the right decision then, and I still believe that today. When we left Iraq, when we left the government, when we left the White House, Iraq was in pretty good shape. We'd been through a lot. It had taken longer than we anticipated. Been a higher level of violence. Without question, there were things that we had not anticipated in the run-up to Iraq. But what we found was that with the surge in 07 and 08, with a change in strategy, moving to a counterinsurgency strategy with Dave Petraeus as the commander, Ryan Crocker as the ambassador. By the end of 08, as we left office, Iraq was in pretty good shape. We thought what was needed was to continue with a stay-behind force so that they'd have intelligence capabilities, some air assets, training, and so forth that would allow them to maintain control over their own sovereign territory. That's what did not happen, obviously, and we're in the state we're now because there was no follow-on.
But do you give the
after we left
president
office.
some credit for trying?
Not really. On the stay-behind force?
Yes.
The history to it, Charlie, was the military originally recognized recommended somewhere between 18 and 20,000 forces to stay behind. They were told no, they couldn't have it. So they went back at 10,000. They were told no, they couldn't have it. And finally they ended up, the White House signing off on maybe 3,000 to 3,500. The follow-on to that was there was never any success to the status of forces agreement. These are the agreement under which we have forces remain in a country and operate. It protects our soldiers from being prosecuted.
But there was a negotiation, is my point.
One brief negotiation, and
They finally set standards. The Iraqis set standards that the United States did not believe they could meet, having to do with immunity.
We have 40 of those agreements around the world. There's always a debate over the degree of sovereignty, the extent to which U.S. forces are going to infringe upon the sovereignty of the host country. Oftentimes that gets to be a key issue because it's an important political issue for the host country. But you get it worked out. They've just now worked it out for the 300 people that have just recently been sent over there. I'm just seeing in the press in the last day or two that they now have come to an understanding of how those forces, our people, will be treated in country if, in fact, problems should arise. So it's not a difficult situation. What was difficult was the president did not want to have, I don't believe, any stay-behind force in Iraq. I don't think it was consistent with the campaign he'd run when he campaigned against our forces in Iraq and promised to bring them all out during the course of the campaign, and I don't think he wanted an agreement.
The reason I asked my question early about mistakes that the administration may have made, as you well know, there are a lot of people who look at the Iraq War now, and they believe that you, in a sense, are out there trying to speak to the legacy, number one. And number two, they believe that is, on your part, a patriotic concern about the country. But the war turned out badly.
Well, it did.
But let me finish, though. It turned out badly until the surge came along and was matched with the awakening.
With the awakening, the Sunnis signed on from Anbar province and
so
joined
mistakes were made.
It was not a flawless war, but I've never seen one that was.
You've heard this as every interview you've done. They're saying, here comes the guy who's responsible for a lot of the bad things went wrong in Iraq now wants to come in and point the finger to the Obama administration for the situation we have in Iraq today. One interviewer after another, as I read these interviews, wants to make that point. And they often even say, how dare he step forward to do that?
Well, Charlie, you've known me a long time, and as far as being subject to criticism goes, it's part of the job description of a vice president. And we were there under especially extraordinary circumstances, and I took a lot of positions I still hold that generated criticism, enhanced interrogation techniques, and I don't hesitate to defend what we did. And with respect to whether or not we did the right thing going into Iraq, I believe it. We can argue about it. Different people have different views. The reason I'm concerned now is because there was a relatively simple proposition in front of the administration. The president, as late as 2011, was talking about what good shape Iraq was in terms of being stable and
because the
sovereign
surge
state.
and the awakening were surprisingly successful.
Exactly.
And even people who opposed it, like the president and then Senator from New York, began to say, wait, this is surprising.
Yes. Well, it was solvable if, in fact, there had been follow-through on the stay-behind force, and that's where it fell down, and there wasn't.
But this is the key point for you.
For me, it's a key point.
Say a force that stayed back there, we would not be looking at ISIS, and it seems to me that's a stretch to say that.
Let me state my own position in terms of how I look at what's happening in Iraq now. I think we've got a much bigger problem than Iraq. I think we've got a problem that there has been a dramatic increase in the number of terrorist groups around the world and a dramatic increase in the number of terrorists. Look at the RAND Corporation. They just put out a report 2 weeks ago, said
58%.
58% between 2010 and 2013. We've got, within the last couple of weeks, we had a major raid on the Karachi airport by the Taliban. Why do we worry about that? Well, Pakistan's got somewhere between 50 and 100 nuclear weapons. The administration has consistently, month in and month out, year after year after year, said there's no problem. We got bin Laden, problem solved. There were no terrorists in Benghazi. It was all a reaction to a video. The president has consistently refused to recognize or to admit that there is a huge problem out there with respect to the proliferation of terror. And it's, I think when you see what's happening in Iraq, you've got part of that is a refusal to recognize the nature of the problem that we're faced with, which is more serious than just Iraq.
Well, some would suggest that, in fact, there was a time in which the administration and bin Laden's the discovery and killing of bin Laden was part of a decimation of al-Qaeda, as we knew al-Qaeda and the al-Qaeda leadership. A lot of that took place. What's happened here, as you well know better than me, is that the spread of al-Qaeda affiliates has been pervasive, not just in the Middle East, but around the world.
West Africa, East Africa, Indonesia.
Yeah. But is that all because of the Obama administration, is my question? Because the op-ed singularly pointed to them as responsible.
Yeah, no. What I would blame them for is their refusal to recognize the spread, their refusal to recognize that there is this proliferation in terrorist groups, Salafi jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda-like. They're not all affiliated with Al-Qaeda, but they have similar objectives, similar religious beliefs, and the number of individual terrorists is estimated by Iran to have doubled in a 4-year period of time. That's what concerns me.
But you
it's a State Department spokesman that goes out basically and talks about core Al-Qaeda. And we've decimated core Al-Qaeda, and about all that's left is Zawahiri, the number 2. That's not true. You know, there is this massive expansion of terrorism in that part of the world that coincides with the U.S. withdrawal from that part of the world, with dramatic reductions in the U.S. defense budget. We act like the administration acts like there is no problem out there. I think there is a huge problem, and related to it is the problem of the proliferation.
But as soon as you say they act like there's no problem, and people step forward, and the president has talked about terrorism per se.
Much.
But I mean, he even said when they were worrying about Russia, he said, "I'm more worried about a terrorist bomb in New York." Mm-hmm. I mean, they have been drone attacks after drone attacks after drone attacks against terrorist leaders in Africa and in other places, as you know. So they have not been unmindful of the threat of terrorism, have they?
Not unmindful. Certainly, they've used the drone program, but I think in terms of just their
more than even the previous administration.
We're the ones who invented it.
I know that, but they used it more than you did, as you know.
Well, they did, but the problem you have, again, you've got to come back to the proposition of how they talk about and think about and operate. We're going to have a pivot to Asia, pull out of the Middle East, pivot to Asia. That hasn't worked out too well for us. We've had the whole proposition with respect to what's happening to the United States military. They've announced, for example, instead of having a 2-war strategy, which has been sort of the Bible for 40 or 50 years, we're going to go to a 1-war strategy in the midst of the chaos that's developing in the Middle East. The question with respect to the proliferation of nuclear weapons was on my mind 5 months before 9/11. There's a quote in New York Magazine in an interview I did with Nick Lehman then, worried about terrorists and weapons of mass destruction. 9/11 was a watershed in terms of going from having a law enforcement problem to having an active war against the United States. And we're back now where I think the proliferation problem on the nuclear front is every bit as serious as is the proliferation with respect to terrorists as well, too. I'm very worried about Pakistan. You have to be worried about Pakistan.
Every president that I have interviewed has said the ultimate worry they have is a terrorist gaining control of a nuclear weapon.
Right.
That is the thing they lose sleep over the most.
That's right.
For a moment of using your expertise, the most likely to happen, you believe, is they develop one or they get their hands on one that belonged to someone else, like the Pakistanis?
Well, you can come up with different scenarios. We do know a couple of things about Pakistan, though. A.Q. Khan, who invented and developed the Pakistan program, also said publicly a couple of years ago that the North Koreans had bribed the Pakistani officials for nuclear weapons technology, the centrifuges. And we've had a group of Americans who've been to North Korea and seen 2,000 centrifuges operating in North Korea, presumably the ones the North Koreans bribed the Pakistanis for. We also had North Korea build a nuclear reactor in Syria, out in eastern Syria, where ISIS comes from. So you've already got a history here, a background that Pakistan is potentially because they've got the weapons, they've tested them, we know they have them, they've shared the technology now with the North Koreans. There's every reason to believe that going forward they may well share it with others. And there's a serious terrorist problem in Pakistan, the Taliban.
Right.
There were 3 or 4 attempts on Musharraf's life. The Taliban are the ones that hit Karachi airport. And we just got through turning back 5 of the top Taliban prisoners at Guantanamo back to the Taliban.
In exchange for Bergdahl.
In exchange for Bergdahl.
You're very much opposed to that.
I am. So I think we're closer than we have ever been any time in the past to a situation where we've got a remarkable growth in terrorism. Part of the problem in Syria and Iraq is that it's become a magnet for jihadi wannabes.
What you're calling for is a strategy against terrorism, a strategy against terrorism,
a worldwide,
underlying strategy.
Global strategy
because
that's adequately funded, that we reverse course on the cutback in U.S. military. We admit that there's a hell of a problem out there, and we begin to operate to deal with it. We rebuild our relationship with the Egyptian military.
But as you have said, this is a strategy this is a fact of life from Africa all the way up to Syria and into Lebanon.
Right.
It's a fact of life there.
But it's worse. It's grown much worse in the last 4 years.
And it's grown much worse in the last 4 years because?
Because of the RAND report. And it's partly religious based, but it's partly because of Al-Qaeda when they are successful or were successful. Now you have in Syria, because we didn't do anything in Syria, perhaps partly, the MI5, who runs the counterterrorism program for the Brits, said half of the cases he's working with respect to terrorism in the UK right now originate from Syria.
Turning to Syria for a moment, what do you think is going to happen there? Because on the one hand, it looks like Assad is in a much better position than he was. And there are those who argue, not now, but 2 years ago, if you had had more support for the moderate rebel forces, that you had Assad on the run. That is no longer true because of the help he's received from Iran,
I didn't
Russia.
have him on the run, but there was a possibility there, yes.
So where is Syria today?
Well, I think Syria today, because the ISIS is so brutal and so bad. I mean, even Al-Qaeda has sort of tried to push him aside. Assad's got himself in a position where he's not the worst option, I suppose, is one way to look at it. I think
So should we change our policy towards Assad?
I think we should, again, have intervened earlier with the Free Syrian movement that wasn't related to Al-Qaeda. But the time to do that was 3 years ago. Now it's gotten late. It's much more difficult. But even today, I would try to beef up our efforts to train and equip some of those Free Syrian forces inside Syria, partly because they can create trouble for ISIS back in the area they've conquered in eastern Syria. We can build a fire under them and make life more difficult for them. But again, it's a case where the president was going to do something in Syria, and then he never quite did it. It was one of the things when Liz and I traveled through the Middle East in March that came up repeatedly, that they were all up on the step ready to go to support an effort, and at the last minute the rug was pulled out from under.
Because the Russians and the U.S. made a deal on chemical weapons with the Syrians, and now the Syrians have gotten rid of all those chemical weapons. Right. And the Prime Minister of Israel now says that was a good deal.
Well,
and he's your friend.
He is a friend. I count him a friend. I think
so
he's also relying upon this administration to persuade the Iranians to give up their nuclear weapons. I'm not sure he's comfortable with that. I don't know. He'll have to speak for himself. I don't speak for Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah, but you now know he's basically said that deal that all the Saudis and everybody was upset about, he now supports and says so. But you're saying he only supports chemical weapons, yes. Yeah. He only supported it. Well, that was the reason the United States did not attack, because that deal was made with the Russians and the Syrians, correct?
Well, I don't know why. I do know that Obama suddenly decided he had to go to the Congress to get authority to do anything with respect to military force, which I don't think he had to do.
Is the problem here? Go ahead.
But again, it's a case where instead of strong leadership out of the administration, we had a lot of folks out there ready to go to support the effort to take action with respect to Syria. And they were all left hanging out to dry, in a sense, when the president backed off and decided not to go that route. One of the individuals I talked with out there, and it was a private conversation, I won't name him, but he, for the first time in all the years I've known him, he is saying, it's gotten to be for me, speaking of himself, politically dangerous in my home country now to be necessarily identified as a friend of the United States. That things had gotten so difficult for him that there was a price to be paid for somebody in his position to be so closely identified with the U.S. Egyptians made the case to me. If you noticed, President Sisi has been to Moscow. He can't come to the United States, again, for political reasons. The argument was, and this came from Egyptian private citizens, is that it would be politically difficult in the streets in Egypt were he to be seen coming to the United States at this stage. That the attitude in Egypt is that this president, Obama, backed the Muslim Brotherhood.
Well, he backed them after they were elected, is when he said they've had a democratic election, and we recognize the people who were elected.
And after he was there,
I bet you your administration would have done the same thing. That the Bush administration, if the Muslim Brotherhood had been elected in the democratic election, because other countries did it as well. Yeah. It wasn't just the Obama administration.
It was a big mistake.
In Western Europe and across the world, other countries recognized the Muslim Brotherhood. They later changed their opinion about them, but they recognized
and the people of Egypt were the ones who suffered under a year's rule. And there's now, insurgency out along the Sinai-Gaza border. There have been problems with Libya. The Egyptian people are delighted that the military stepped in, but
you got 97% of the vote, I think.
Well, I think he did. It's because nobody else ran. But I think there's an overwhelming view, and it is a consensus view in Egypt today, that the United States supported what they found to be a very, very difficult and unacceptable set of circumstances under Morsi, who wanted to create another Islamist republic such as we've got in Iran today. So the point, the way we've operated out there has undermined these relationships, some of them which go back 30, 40, or 50 years.
Clearly, there are those who have different political views than you, say that it probably contributed to the problem we have today, that we didn't have American forces there, because they may have had a kind of moderating influence on Maliki, the prime minister, if they'd been there.
I would agree.
And that he might not have been so willing to shut out the Sunnis, and which created the problem, and have made some of them now join ISIS in certain ways.
And I think if you'd had Ryan Crocker in there on a regular basis, I think if you'd had Petraeus, Ray Odierno in there on a regular basis, they would have been able to moderate, if you will, Maliki's activities vis-a-vis the Sunni.
Okay, let me bring this conversation. You not only were vice president during the Iraq War, you also were Secretary of Defense during the first Iraq War. And Colin Powell was chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And so you experienced that war with Saddam Hussein. Mm-hmm. And then there was the Iraqi war. Now, Iraq is facing a more difficult situation for both Iraq and the United States that we've seen. In fact, one of the former acting director of the CIA here, Mike Morrell, said the most difficult situation we've found since the 73 war. Mm-hmm. Now, my point is, what would you do? David Petraeus says, no air power. We don't want to use air power to come in on the side of the Shias. I don't know what Leon Panetta says. I really want to know what Dick Cheney would do now.
Well, the first thing I would say is recognize it for what it is, that it's part of a much larger problem, and we need a broader strategy, and we need to reverse course on a lot of policies that are now in place with the military, et cetera.
And that goes beyond Iraq.
That's right, but I would start down that road because there are a lot of things you can do there that need to be addressed. With respect to Iraq itself, the things I found that especially noteworthy in the last few days is the position, for example, that Ayatollah Sistani has taken.
Right.
Remarkable man. I'm not sure this is the right analogy, but for the Shia in Iraq and a lot of them in Iran and Lebanon, he's the rough equivalent of the Pope for Catholics. A man of enormous respect and regard, has always been very cautious and very careful in what he says and does politically.
And has never met with an American.
And has called for Maliki to step aside. Right. Very, very significant.
Did he actually say he has to step aside?
The press report I saw said he'd recommended Maliki step aside. I think that's a major, major shot across the bow, and I think it offers the possibility that indeed you may get a change in government. They're trying to put together a government now off the last election, and that may be the brightest spot you can hope for.
By the way, that's the Obama position.
Mm-hmm.
to try to get Maliki to step aside so that you can create some kind of coalition government made up of Shia and Sunni
Right.
that you can fight for to stop ISIS.
I think there's a consensus view that Maliki has run out his string, whether it's Obama or Cheney or whoever it is. I think anybody who looks at
who on the same
would like to see Maliki step aside.
I mean, everybody seems to agree, you, the president, that what you got to do is have a government you can support there, and a government that's a coalition government, and a government that will be attractive to all parties so they won't split out, and so they can have a united force against ISIS.
That would be the ideal.
What's the likelihood of that?
I don't know. I don't know that anybody does know. I feel better about it now because Sistani's taken a public position.
He's also called for all these militias to come out. Everybody in Iran, every Shia in Iran should come out and fight for Iraq, not in Iran, but fight for Iraq. That also means that Moqtada al-Sadr, who you know well in terms of what force he had,
Not personally, but I know he is, yeah.
He's now back in the game in terms of all these militias rearming, ready to go to battle to save Shia Iraq.
And especially their religious shrines.
Yeah.
Great importance. It's very worrisome, but again, it's one of those developments that could have been avoided, for example, if the military had been up to snuff, but the military wasn't up to snuff because Maliki had in fact run off a lot of the Sunni commanders that had been purged from
and
the
evacuation had run off a lot of the Sunni commanders.
That was many, many years ago, Charlie. It was not anywhere close.
But they were still some of the generals, that Sunni generals who were eliminated because they were...
Well, that in the past, possibly. But when we were there during the surge, we had good cooperation. There were some really good commanders, primarily Sunni, who fought alongside our guys, did a bang-up job. They would, I think the Iraqi forces would be in good shape today if they hadn't been a purge that Maliki ran against Sunnis in the military.
Support a new government. Hopefully Maliki will step down and have the Ayatollah Sistani being a strong voice there for doing something. Would you have the United States engage in airstrikes?
It depends. I'm not sure you can make that charge right now. If you were going to do anything, just to say airstrikes, especially in build-up areas, I think it's a very hard proposition. You don't want to be, as somebody suggested the other day, you don't want to be the Air Force for the Shia.
That was David Petraeus.
Dave. And but some of the things we did, the way we operated when we first went into Afghanistan, strikes me as possibly applicable here, where we had special forces, meaning not special operators, but special forces going in, speak the language, sign up with the locals, and carry with them the capacity to call in and laser direct on targets that ought to be taken out.
And then the Northern Alliance forces came sweeping down.
Exactly, but that's a different kind of a situation, and it involved putting some people on the ground.
There is a risk if you use air power that you will turn people against you.
You do not want to use it in a way. Again, I come back. To use it at this stage when there's so much criticism of the Maliki government, when he hasn't stepped aside at this point, raises the specter that you create a lot of problems with respect to the Sunnis, not only inside Iraq, but a lot of our friends in the region who are also Sunni.
The Iranians. As you know, Soleimani has been there in Baghdad, ready to use Iranian militias to support fellow Shiites.
Right.
Can we stop that?
We certainly shouldn't encourage it. I don't think some have suggested we should work with the Iranians
to stop ISIS.
Some kind of joint venture. That bothers me a great deal. I think Iran's a hell of a problem. One of the difficulties, again, if I go back to my visit of a couple of months ago, one of the lines of argument with respect to the Obama administration is that while they're out there trying to negotiate some kind of an arrangement on nukes, they don't have a lot of confidence that it's going to produce anything. Most of them believe it's just paper to cover over a nasty situation until the administration leaves town. But they're also deeply concerned because they don't see anything being done about the other ways Iran acts to try to dominate the region, the support they provide for Hezbollah and for Hamas and so forth. They're viewed generally as bad actors. And for us to be perceived by...
What they've done as a friend of Syria.
What they've done as a friend of Syria. But I don't think we want to be perceived by our other friends in the region out there as in cahoots with the Iranians. I think that would be a big negative for the Egyptians and the Emirates and the Saudis and others. Yeah.
Who believe that there is, I'm asking this as a question, that there's a great conflict, the Saudis believe, for sort of prominence in the Gulf between them because of their wealth and the Iranians.
And religion. And the king
center of the religion.
King is the guardian of the two holy places. Yeah. And that's very important to them.
So if you tick this up, no airstrikes right now, because you don't know where the targets are yet until you get some people there can be precise. 2, 300 people there, 300 special forces now. No boots on the ground right now, I assume, other than what you have there?
It depends on what you're talking about. In terms of putting a large U.S. contingent into Iraq, no, I don't see that happening.
What else would you do?
Well, again, I think you've got to. I'd work very closely with the other surrounding states where we've got relationships, who are going to be vulnerable to whatever happens inside Iraq and Syria. Jordan comes immediately to mind. Obviously, the Saudis, the Emirates, all the Persian Gulf states. There ought to be a major effort by the administration to rebuild those relationships, because those relationships are in terrible shape right now. And we've got a common enemy, and that common enemy is radical Islam. And we need to be able to work with them so that, if nothing else, we can keep it from spreading beyond where it is today in Iraq. But I also think it would make sense for us, as I mentioned earlier, to get heavily involved, more so than we have up till now, in supporting the free Iraqi or free Syrian movement with weapons and training and so forth.
You can do that without the risk of falling into hands of all those radical groups that have grown?
There's always that possibility, but I think it's important to, if you will, build a backfire where ISIS is concerned. They've moved a lot of them from eastern Syria down into Iraq, give them some problems back in their home territory in eastern Syria.
They now control the border between Syria and Iraq.
Exactly.
And part of the border between Jordan and Iraq.
Right. But you ought to be able to do some things with the Turks, too. The Turks are major players up in that part of the world, and they have, I think, as much at stake to some extent as we do, and they clearly have.
What role do you think the Qataris are playing?
My guess is they're up to no good. That is my conviction based on experience in the past. I don't think the Qataris are.
What experience in the past confirms your opinion?
The role they did, for example, with Al Jazeera. They fund Al Jazeera. That's the hometown newspaper, so to speak, but they used it very aggressively against us back in the early days when we were dealing with problems in Iraq and Afghanistan. There is an absolute conviction on the part of our friends in the region out there that they fund the more radical elements, are actually supported financially. While I was there, the Saudis actually, for the first time ever, broke off diplomatic relations between themselves and Qatar. I think the Emirates have followed along and done the same. They've never done that before in all of the years of operations in that part of the world.
What do they want?
The Saudis?
Yeah, no.
Qataris? I've asked that question of dozens of people out there, and you get the same answer. They're not certain.
They want influence, is what they say.
They want influence.
They want influence.
They want influence, and partly I think they play a good game with us because everybody again looks at it. Our friends say, "Well, you guys let them get away with it. You know what they're doing, and you let them get away with it." And the reason is supposedly because we have that big base up there at Al Udeid, where it is our biggest base in the Middle East, is on Qatari property. So it's leverage for the Qataris to in effect, get away with the kind of activity they do with respect to supporting the more radical elements of the jihadi movement.
Yeah, but I hope you, and as Secretary Kerry and the Australians and the Brits have done, will loudly denounce the Egyptians for the 3 Al Jazeera newsmen being sentenced to 7 years.
I haven't seen that. I'm not familiar with it.
You haven't read that story in the front page of the paper that
no.
3 Al Jazeera reporters were sentenced by 7 years by Egyptian courts?
Yeah, I missed that one.
When you look at, should we have seen ISIS coming? I mean, they seem to have more strength, to be smarter. I mean, they go into Mosul and they open the banks, take all the money.
$450 million or something like that. Yeah,
That can help a group like that
that's right. That's
buy
a lot
weapons.
of cash.
to buy weapons. Should we have foreseen it? Was this a
Well,
was this a failure of intelligence in the same way, that weapons of mass destruction in Iraq was a failure of intelligence?
I don't know that it was a failure of intelligence, Charlie, because I haven't seen the reporting. One way to look at it
in terms
would
of
be,
the Iraqis and ISIS.
yes, and ISIS in particular. And the one possibility is that our guys did in fact pick up on it, but at the policy level, it was never acted upon.
Meaning they recommended to the president, we got a problem with some groups like ISIS, and nobody did anything?
I don't know. I haven't seen those reports, but I don't automatically assume our guys missed it. I just don't know. I think there's a real possibility that it didn't track with the narrative that we got bin Laden terrorism problem solved, and the narrative that says Benghazi wasn't a terrorist attack.
But with respect, isn't that a stretch to say, I come back to a point made earlier,
Show
we've
me.
got bin Laden, therefore terrorism. I never heard anybody say that. I did have them say we have wiped out a number of the leadership of Al-Qaeda.
Core Al-Qaeda.
Core Al-Qaeda.
always
But they
qualify
never
it.
said that we've got terrorism control. I've never heard the president or anyone else say that, and you've said it several times, that was their opinion, that terrorism is not a problem. I mean, isn't that a stretch?
No, well, my point is, and I think it's a valid one, that when you're 2 months out from the election last fall and you have a terrorist assault, probably Al-Qaeda related, on Benghazi and kill 4 of our guys, and then you call it video reaction of some kind, you do that for political reasons. Because if you admitted that there'd been a terrorist attack on our facility in Benghazi, then the narrative they had going that they'd gotten on top of the terrorism problem wouldn't have been valid. It might have cost them the election. It's that mindset that I'm concerned about, and I think it's true, and I think it's a valid description of the way the administration has looked at the whole problem of terror. My view. And, Charlie, I'm not running for anything. I get to say exactly what I think.
As I said, you're a patriot, but at the same time, there's a sense of you look at the policies that you want to defend, and Iraq brings you forward to say, look, we had it right and they screwed it up. And Iraq was a troubled place even after.
Yeah.
Correct.
See, I look at as having had a set of views about the dangers we face from that part of the world based on terrorism, based on the proliferation of nuclear weapons and weapons of mass destruction. And I've been consistent over the years. I've never backed off that concern.
Peter Baker wrote a book about you.
He did.
Did you read it?
I did.
Okay. He suggests in that book that back to the first Gulf War, that you felt that because of a variety of things, helicopters and other things, and not going to Baghdad, that Saddam survived, and that haunted you.
No, that's not the way I describe it. The way I would describe it is we all believed, senior American leadership, the president, and virtually all of us on the War Council, believed that the drubbing we administered to Saddam as we ran him out of Kuwait would cause his demise politically, that he'd never survive. And what happened instead was he was able to turn that around, and the mere fact that he had survived, that the U.S. had done its damnedest, and he was still standing, he turned that into a victory for himself.
But he had also the use of helicopters to somehow shut off Shiite attacks.
Schwarzkopf
Negotiated.
negotiated it at the end. Bridges were out and everything. I can't fault Norm for that, and he's no longer here to defend himself.
Well, exactly.
But my point
you
was
supported the agreement. I mean, wait a minute, you're not just wasn't your general making that agreement. You had to sign off on it.
No, it was done at the level when they were negotiating the ceasefire. I think up at I can't remember the name of the town now. But no, my point is Saddam, it was a masterful performance on his part when he was able to use what by our standards would be abject defeat and turn it into a victory. And he peddled it that way and survived when none of us thought he could. None of our intelligence people
Have you
did
thought
either.
about it in the intervening years, what might have been if we had kept the attack in Afghanistan and maybe had Osama bin Laden on the run then and had not invaded Iraq?
No, not really.
Why not? Why not? I mean,
because
you are
I
a
believe,
historical character.
right, and I believe very deeply in what we did, and I think we did the right thing.
Okay, that's fair enough. And as they say, I mean, there are others who believe exactly like you do, and a lot of them are speaking up now. But my point is, haven't you thought about it? I mean, you are an intelligent man who thought about, what if we hadn't done that? What if we don't do that? What if we don't invade Iraq? How might it have turned out, and what would have been different, and what were the negative implications of the Iraqi invasion?
But, Charlie, if you go back and look at the circumstances we were dealing with in the aftermath of 9/11, 3,000 dead Americans, World Trade Centers gone, etc., you see the chain of reporting on intelligence on two fronts, with respect to terrorism and with respect to weapons of mass destruction and the proliferation of that capability. And you see the reporting that we had from the first day, right after the election. Watch out for Iraq's WMD from the intelligence community. And for 27 months thereafter.
And other countries believed they had them.
Other countries believed him. Most of his own people did. For the president to have ignored that under those circumstances would have been, I think that would have been dereliction of duty.
My point is not to debate that war, but the point is that some people feel like that we amassed a fleet there and that we should have waited for more inspections to determine whether he had them or not. My question is more historical. What if we didn't? Would it have been different? Are there such negative repercussions from that long war and where we see ourselves now that we would have been better off if we hadn't gone in? And
I don't believe that. I think we did what we had to do, and you don't get to go back and say, well, what if we'd ignored all the intelligence? What if we'd ignored George Tenet sitting on the couch in the Oval Office and the president asking him, how good's that intelligence, George? And George said, it's a slam dunk, Mr. President, a slam dunk.
Were you sitting there?
I was. I was between the president and George.
And he said it's a slam dunk.
A slam dunk, Mr. President,
we
slam
have
dunk.
The information.
We've just been briefed on the overview of the intelligence on WMD.
How come they were wrong? Or were they wrong in your judgment?
Well, I think it was as I look back at it, you can't just say they were 100% wrong. I don't think they were. I mean, there were buying centrifuges.
Or maybe it was chemical somewhere.
Well, maybe that. Maybe one story I heard was it was corruption. The procurement system was corrupt, and that somebody was getting kickbacks for every time they bought a centrifuge.
The conventional wisdom is that he wanted the Iranians to think he had them, and he wanted his own people to think, and therefore he couldn't admit that he didn't.
I think there's part of that too. So it's all by guess and by gar at this stage. But I believe deeply in what we did then, and again, as I say, for me, the bottom line was when we left office, Iraq was in good shape, and now we're in a situation where obviously we've got another big problem.
How would you define good shape?
There'd been a dramatic reduction in the level of violence, dramatic reduction in the number of
sectarian violence,
car bombs. You had the Sunnis and the Shia pretty much pulling together in the military. The awakening out in Anbar province was a very, very significant development, and that it was in good shape to be handed off to a greater extent than it had been up to that point to the Iraqis, with some U.S. forces staying behind, as we have all over the world, to make certain that they were up to the task. That's that's where the current circumstance developed.
This may surprise you. I find that you and the president seem to be about the same place as to what we ought to do now in Iraq. You see any difference?
Well, I've never had anybody put it that way.
Well, I'm putting it that way.
Yeah.
Aren't you about the same place?
The position I've taken, Charlie.
Tell me one difference you have with the president in terms of what he has said he plans to do, wants to do.
I see it as part of a much larger problem.
Okay, I'll get to that. But I mean, with respect to Iraq today and the decisions of the president, you're pretty much where he is.
Well, where I am,
it's okay to agree with the president.
I hope
you've made clear.
I hope Maliki is replaced by somebody we can work with.
That's one. Welcome. I told her, you've got 300 troops there, special forces.
Yeah.
You haven't ruled out airstrikes, although you're saying we've got to make sure that we can hit the right targets because you're aware of the complications.
But
that's
remember,
all where the president is.
Yeah, but remember where the military wanted to be on the advisory force was 20,000.
This is
And
in
you've
terms of
got-
the negotiation.
In terms of negotiation, but in terms of the stay behind force.
That's what I mean. How
And
many troops?
Barack Obama's for 300.
Yeah,
That's a big
Well, they
difference.
went from 25 to 20 to 15.
I never would have cut from 25 to 10, or from 20 to 10, and 10 to 3.
Your theory on that is that the Iraqis finally said, look, they're not really serious, and so we're going to give up the negotiation. Fair enough.
Well, and the one who gave him negotiations is Barack Obama. I don't think he wanted to see troops behind in Iraq for political reasons.
Or because he believed that the wars there, the long two wars there, had not been in American interest. And he wanted to extract us from there, and understood the great sacrifice that Americans had made, but that he wanted, in a sense, to build new relationships.
I think he was wrong.
Okay. I close with this, because this is where, at core, this is where you are. You want to define a new strategy against the alarming increase in terrorism.
And the potential proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Lay out for me the Cheney plan.
I would immediately reverse course on the military. I would put the military front and center in terms of budget. I'd go back to a two-war strategy,
About
not a
raising
one-war
taxes
strategy.
to
I would if I had to, yes.
Exactly.
Absolutely. If I
Raise
had to do
taxes
it,
if
if that's the
necessary.
only way I could get first-rate military, I'd do it, because it's that important. It's more important than anything else we do.
But
And it's the president's most important responsibility,
Fair
too.
enough.
He may
National
not
security.
recognize it, but it is.
But it's important for you to say, look, if you have to raise taxes, raise taxes. We've got to have
We
a
have
strong
to have
military.
a strong military. Second, I would stop talking about withdrawing from Afghanistan. We ought to stay in Afghanistan. We shouldn't be scaling back. Why? Well, in part because that's where we keep track of what's going on in Pakistan. Where do we launch from to get bin Laden, who's found a sanctuary in Pakistan?
Yeah.
We launch from Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan
How do we
first,
keep
and then-
track of those nukes in Pakistan? From Afghanistan. The last thing we need to do is to add to the vacuum that's already been created in that part of the world by the way we're operating out of Iraq, planning to get out of Afghanistan.
How many troops would you like to see stay in Afghanistan?
I'd like to have as many troops there as our experts and our military believe is necessary to make certain the Afghans can control the situation. The Taliban won't come in and take over.
And do you think the president wants the same amount?
He never has before. Whatever the Pentagon gives him, he cuts in half.
So basically, he has said that at the end of 2014, there'll be what? X number remaining.
In Afghanistan.
Until 2016.
2016 is the target date
right.
to have everybody out.
And you'd like to see him beyond 2016.
I think it's exactly the wrong thing to do.
And what would you do? What's your strategy for Africa and for Yemen and for all those places where there is some affiliate of Al Qaeda?
Well, we've got to develop some kind of a strategy to help deal with it. Now, we can't be everywhere. We don't want to have our major U.S. Forces scattered around the globe like that, but we ought to be able to work with or find third parties we can work through to take on some of those organizations. Yemen's an especially difficult place. But around Yemen, you've got Saudi Arabia, obviously.
They use drones in Yemen to take out.
We've used drones in Yemen. We've got bases, make sure we've got bases, various places that we can operate out of with our special ops guys or our drone trafficking and so forth. So you need to change the mindset. Quit talking about a pivot to Asia. It's never going to happen. It shouldn't happen. Asia's important all by itself, but it's all been used as a cover. I was briefed at one point. I got a phone call from a senior official in the Defense Department when they first announced the pivot to Asia. And he called me as a former Secretary of Defense, give me the word and so forth, and I listened to him and asked a bunch of questions. And he eventually kind of got exasperated, and he said, look, Mr. Secretary, he called me, look, you've got to understand this is all budget-driven. Didn't have a damn thing to do with strategy. There was no strategic rationale that justified withdrawing from the Middle East. And that's exactly what we've been doing. That's exactly what we need to reverse and head back in the other way. I'd restore the military-to-military relationship between us and the Egyptians, enormously important. I'd help Sisi every chance I got. Same for Abdullah and Jordan. Same for our friends up and down the Gulf. Same for the Saudis.
Bahrain.
The Emirates, Abu Dhabi, Dubai.
Right.
Yeah. I think we've got to recognize the danger that we're faced with. I think if the nuclear negotiations fail with Iran, and I fully expect they will, then there are going to be others in the region who are going to have nuclear weapons. You're not going to be able to.
How close do you think the Iranians might be?
I think they're very close.
6 months, year?
I haven't seen any classified reporting for 5 years, but I think they're very
You
close.
talk to people, for goodness sakes. I mean, we
Yeah,
just talked about
I
the
think-
tour of the Middle East.
I
Those
think they're
guys
very
make it
close.
their business to know.
I always remember the summer of 1990, before Saddam invaded Kuwait. Secretary of Defense and my counterpart from Israel came, Misha Aarons,
Right.
and Ehud Barak, who was then the head of the IDF, and they briefed me on Saddam's nuclear program. This is 1990. And they thought he was fairly close to achieving a nuclear device at that point. Our intelligence said no. He was working on it, but he was some years away. After the war was over with and the IAEA went in, neutral international organization, said that if it hadn't been for what we did during Desert Storm, Saddam would have had a nuclear device by late 02, or late 92 then.
They would have had one also, perhaps, if the Israelis had not gone
Back in the 80s.
Back in the 80s.
But my point is, our intelligence hasn't always been that reliable. The Israelis, certainly in that part of the world, in my view, do a better job than we do in terms of estimating when
you think their
somebody's
red
doing
line
something.
is narrower than our red line?
I think it is, and I think they're probably right.
But they think they don't have the luxury of testing whether we'll go if they don't go.
Mm-hmm.
That's the problem they have. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. In other words, we have to operate on our red line, even though the United States would be better able to do something if push came to shove.
I don't think anybody
But they
out there.
can't let it go past their red line, they say, because that means that they're putting their own welfare at the mercy of others.
I don't think they believe we'll do anything.
So therefore,
Therefore, if anybody,
they will go if they think he's close.
I think so. I don't know that.
And what will be
Nobody's
the
told me.
repercussions of that
Well, what are the repercussions if they don't?
if they have a nuclear
You have
weapon?
you have a nuclear-armed Iran. They've got a nuclear weapon, and they've certainly got the launch systems and so forth to deliver it. At that point, I think you're going to have something of an arms race in the Middle East for nuclear weapons. And the PACs have already sold technology to the North Koreans. I've got to
And how
believe
you and
there are a lot of people out there.
who developed their nuclear weapon is a national hero,
Mr. A.Q. Khan.
A.Q. Khan.
Sure.
And does not allow Americans are not allowed to talk to him.
But
Am I right?
You're right, but you're getting into a sensitive area now. I used to send messages through a third party.
Yes.
But there'll be enormous pressure on the Saudis, on maybe the Emirates, others in the region. And when the Iranians have a nuclear weapon, they're not going to be the only nuclear power out there. Obviously, Israel's already there, but there will be other nuclear powers as well.
It is said that the Saudis could do it quickly because the Pakistanis owe them.
They
true?
have
true?
over the years provided a great deal of free oil to Pakistan.
So if everybody was going for a nuke, the Saudis have a call on the Pakistani nuclear supply.
I've heard that speculation.
Someone said here a couple of nights ago they don't think that ISIS could take Baghdad. Do you think ISIS could take Baghdad?
I have my doubts. Just in terms of
really a Shia
numbers,
city.
it's a lot of the Sunnis have left parts of Baghdad where they were, and you have mobilized a significant number of Shia militia now. And my guess is that they can defend Baghdad.
Again, thank you for coming.
You bet.
Dick Cheney, former Vice President of the United States, former Secretary of Defense, former minority leader in Congress.
Number two, minority whip.
Number two, minority whip in Congress, a conversation about Iraq. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.